And at this time, I'm going to introduce Hannah Posner, our summer intern, who has managed to put together this event. And I'm going to invite Hannah to introduce Julia and Ami.
Hi everyone. We're so excited and honored to have Julia Angwin and Ami Fields-Meyer here with us tonight. They're the authors. They're the authors of the newly released book on courage: How to Be a Dissident in an Age of Fear. So Julia Angwin is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist. She's a former investigative reporter and editor at the Wall Street Journal and ProPublica. She founded The Markup in 2018 and Proof News in 2024, and she's spent her career holding powerful institutions accountable and exposing abuses of power in technology, surveillance, and artificial intelligence. And Ami Fields-Meyer is a former White House senior policy advisor. He's a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation. He was a senior policy advisor for Vice President Kamala Harris. And as a political strategist, speechwriter, and writer, his work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and Foreign Policy. So we're so excited to have Ami and Julia here with us tonight. So we're going to start off with some questions. Please put questions in the chat. Our first question is, how would you advise someone who feels overwhelmed by our current political climate and wants to do something but isn't sure where to start?
Well, first of all, hello. Thank you for having us. I'm gonna let Ami start because he has to leave early, so he needs to get a little speaking time in first. And also, this is his favorite question.
Well, thank you, Hannah, and thank you, JJ, and Laura, and Katie, and everybody with Indivisible across wherever you happen to be tuning in from. We really wrote this book for communities like this and for people like this, and so we are really gratified that it has found an audience in folks who are trying to get involved. Let me just start perhaps with a word on the book, and where it came from and what it is for those who are new to the book on courage, and then I'll answer. I'll offer a couple of answers to this I think really important question. I'm glad that you're getting straight to it. Julia and I started right after the presidential election, the 2024 presidential election, calling up dissidents all over the world. We called people in Venezuela and Russia and Hungary and Nicaragua and in places where folks had faced some form of political repression. And the reason we did this was because we began to feel, as many of you I'm sure do, that the civic environment of the United States was changing, that the tools that we had been taught to use in normative American politics and the tools of democracy were still important, but seemed to be less and less effective. We also, at the same time, began to see things that most of us in our lifetimes have not seen: masked agents on the streets, taking people, sending them off to prisons without due process, punishing people for what they'd said, the president going after political enemies. So we set out to write a book that really tried to answer the question: when you object, but things feel really risky, what do you do? And so that's what we did. And that's what this book on courage is all about. I'll answer this question in a couple of ways, although I will just say, Hannah, it's a really good opening question. This book is 16 lessons, 16 stories on people who have answered that question and found a way to get involved in the community in some form or another. But I'll just tell you a couple of examples of ways to deal with this. The most important thing that we heard from people in every context was that the way that they were able to hear a voice in their head that said that something was wrong and follow that as opposed to suppressing it, to actually take the risk and become a dissident, was to do it in community, to find a political home. Most people told us that they found between 8 and 12 other people who shared their basic values. And what we found from history all the way to the present was that the thing that gave people strength to continue their activism was that regular gathering. We have in this country, in the United States, a culture of having maybe a spiritual home or a faith community that you come back to. We also have other kinds of communities, like social communities, but for whatever reason, most of us, obviously not on this call, don't have a political home. And I think in a moment of political crisis like this one, we heard from Soviet dissidents for example, that it's both helpful to have a political home to strategize for the pragmatics of it, but also from a sort of spiritual perspective, because authoritarianism is about lies, and getting together with people regularly so they can say you're not crazy is an emboldening. The one other thing that I would just say, and then I'll either pass it to Julia or pass it back to Hannah, that we've heard from people all over the world was that it's really important to repurpose your networks. I think that people think that when there's a political crisis, you have to start from scratch. And that's not true. You don't have to start from scratch. Over and over again, all over the world, we heard about people repurposing the networks and the communities that they already had into a political force. And so one example of this is that the dissidents who helped bring down communism in Czechoslovakia were not like a random group of people who just happened to come together. These were theater actors. Václav Havel and others were theater actors who already knew each other, who had deep relationships, who had done work together. And so they actually repurposed not only their relationships, but also they turned their theaters into organizing hubs. They turned the printers that had been used to print playbills into printers for flyers to try to get people organized. And so we see this over and over and over and over again. I'll pause here and see if Julia has anything to add, or we can pass it over to him.
Well, I guess the other thing I would add is that we started this work, and I think a lot of people have this idea that we had, which was that dissidents are heroes and they're the man in front of the tank, and it's incredibly physically risky and courageous. And what we found was, of course, that's true, but also there's a huge, huge amount of the spade work, of dissident work, that is caring for your community, that is handing out water bottles to families outside the ICE detention center, that is helping trans people flee a state that has criminalized their existence, that is writing a letter to your employer and organizing your colleagues saying, don't cave in to the administration's demands. And so there's a lot of work that I think is just more accessible to people. And that is really one of the reasons we wrote the book, was we wanted people to see that they could join this movement without actually having to do the things that they saw in the movies.
Thank you, Ami and Julia. That feeds right into the second question, which is, you spend a lot of time talking about the word dissident and defining dissident in a way that feels accessible, rather than heroic. It seems like a deliberate choice. Talk to us about that word and what it means to you and why you chose that word.
Yeah, we chose it honestly a little bit in defiance of the dissidents themselves. Most dissidents told us they did not think of themselves as dissidents. And they also, by the way, told us they did not think of themselves as courageous. They really described their work as living their values in the world that had abandoned their values, right? And so we talk in the book a little bit about this, the mental aspect of it, which is there's a real negative connotation to dissident, which is you're against something. But almost everybody we talked about was motivated by being for something, right? And yet we chose those words because they are a political shorthand. We're not talking about the kind of courage it takes to, be a marathoner. And there's other types of courage in the world. And so we did want to use the shorthand of political courage that is these words, while acknowledging the flaws in them. Because everyone really told us that they didn't feel like they had a choice. They said, I couldn't live with myself if I was to turn away from the cruelty I was witnessing, the corruption I was witnessing, the lawlessness I was being asked to be complicit in, right? And so we are very explicit about the fact that the dissidents are actually trying to live their values, and that is a positive attribute.
Nothing else to say on that. That was pretty good, Julia.
Put it in my greatest hits list.
Thanks so much. Katie and Katie, do we have questions in the chat we should address?
We have no questions just yet. A lot of excitement. We have people from actually all over. We saw some LA, some Pennsylvania, as well as a lot of North Carolina. So thank you everyone for joining us. But we can go on to the next question, JJ, and then I'll let you know if we have anything from the chat.
I think this one's yours, Hannah.
So the next question is, was there a story from one of the dissidents you interviewed that surprised you or challenged you?
I will say, Hannah, that an enormous amount of our reporting surprised me. I think we expected, as Julia alluded to before, we expected not only to see the sort of man on the tank kind of dissident, but we also expected that a lot of this work of pushing back on a repressive regime was going to be really technical, and so much of it was really communal. I'll say a couple of things that I found surprising, challenging. It's all a little bit challenging. One thing that I found surprising was what enables people to take risky political action. So I'll give you a couple of different examples of what people said to us enabled them to take risky political action. That is to maybe join a protest, to risk arrest, but also just to speak out in their workplace or speak out in their community in some way that felt high stakes, and when everyone else was going the other direction. So one thing that we learned is there's a very important study that came out of the University of Arizona in 2005 from a couple of sociologists who were trying to figure out what's the number one determinant for somebody taking a risky political action. And what they found is that it actually has nothing to do with, it's not race, it's not ethnicity, it's not educational status, it's not gender. The thing that is most likely determines whether you're willing to do something risky in politics is whether you've been asked. Whether you have been asked to, which is shocking a little bit, right? You expect it to be something different. You expect it to be sort of, or maybe you're preternaturally courageous, or there's some other thing, but that's what it is. And I think it actually also makes a lot of sense. So we hear stories and story after story after story from across the world of people who were not going to be involved, but did get involved when somebody asked them to, and not just when somebody asked them to show up, but when somebody asked them to do something. We engaged with people who are students who are involved in anti-corruption protests right now in Serbia, in the biggest protest since the downfall of Slobodan Milosevic at the turn of the century. And what they told us was that the way that they grew their movement, the way that they got people to the front lines, was instead of saying, come to the front lines and barricade the university so that we can get into the news, they said, we don't need you to do that. What we need you to do is just bring some blankets to us because it's cold out here. And when they brought the blankets, what they witnessed was the camaraderie that was going on among their friends, and it got them to give a little bit of money and then to make some pancakes and then eventually to be on the front themselves. So we see this all over the place. We saw that same pattern play out in Hong Kong among the dissidents that we spoke to, and here in the United States. I'll say one other thing about what moved people to, I keep saying sort of took risky political action, but maybe I would just say get involved in a meaningful way to do something that felt big to them when it felt like the walls of history were closing in. And that is that they tapped into a bigger vision. So one of my favorite stories in the book is from a Brown University professor named Nadia Al-Ali, who is a green card holder. She's not a citizen of the United States. And she teaches Middle Eastern studies at Brown University. And when it came time, when a group of university professors got together to sue the Trump administration for the ideological deportation policy, the policy that basically said, if you engage in pro-Palestinian speech, you might be deported or rounded up. What they needed was at least one or probably a couple of professors to come forward and say, I am not a citizen and I felt like there was a chill in my speech. That's called standing, and if the lawyers know, in order for the case to be heard. And so she decided to do it. But when you talk to her about why she decided to do it, even though she could have been deported, she could have had enormous professional and personal consequences. She says that it's basically because she felt a calling because of her background, but also because she was convinced by the movement lawyers who were involved with this work, who were putting forward this lawsuit, that there was a strategy. And so what enabled her and what emboldened her was not to do it on her own, but to find a place to be one domino in a long chain of dominoes. So that's the other thing I would do. Say one is give people a task, and the other thing is show them where they belong in the big strategy at hand, and that will help people find the courage to do one or two small things that might have major consequences.
Julia, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, that's fine.
Thank you, Ami, for talking about Bring the Blankets. It was one of my most inspiring parts of the book. And those simple things lead to deeper involvement. We do have a question from the chat. Katie, do you want to go ahead and ask it?
Yes. So similar to some of the things you guys addressed, but a little more specific, how do we think we can best engage people who are apathetic or don't think their voice matters? How do we reach those people? And they do specify other than engaging our own personal groups, because we know that was kind of talked about before. Do you guys have any other good tactics for that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we get asked a lot actually is, do I have to convince my MAGA relatives to switch sides? And the literature and the research says no. Don't waste your time on people who are fully committed to the authoritarian project. There's a theory about authoritarian regimes where there's three kinds of people: the people who are fully committed to the regime, there are people who are fully dissidents who are fighting it, and then there's a huge number of people in the middle. And the fight against authoritarianism is literally it's about winning in the middle and getting them to join the side of the dissidents. And that means that you have to make it compelling for them, right? Which is one reason nonviolent protest is so important, right? The data shows that nonviolent protest is twice as effective as violent, and that's largely because nonviolence is better marketing, right? In Minneapolis, the protesters were nonviolent and the state was violent. And what that meant was the narrative was that the state was bad, the protesters were good, and the state had to leave and back down from their violent antics, right? And that is how you defeat authoritarianism, with a battle after battle like that, where the resistance movement is nonviolent but not cooperative, right? And Maria Stefan calls this collective stubbornness. And so the way to get people to join you in collective stubbornness is honestly to model it. They have to see you doing it, right? The reason street protest works is that it's visible. The actions you're doing at work are super important, like Naja Ali testifying, but it's not as visible, right? So protest on the street is a way for the rest of the world to know, oh, you know what? This is like, a lot of people are doing this. I should think about it, right? So modeling collective stubbornness, whether it's at a street protest, whether it's at a boycotting, whether it's strikes, all of those things are ways to bring people into the movement once they see that it's possible. So much of the apathy is about the fact that they feel hopeless, and they also don't see any role for themselves. They don't see any agency. And so what you all do, right? I mean, this is literally the purpose of Indivisible, so I don't know why I'm even telling you all this, but the literature supports your efforts.
Can I just add one other thing on this, which is the other thing about building a movement that I think that probably most of us have found in our own lives and our own recruitment of our friends and family is that it's really important to not demand that people become somebody else in order to join. The threshold of engagement, the threshold of entrance needs to be low enough. I don't think either of us would say that it needs to be like at the floor. It's important to be able to identify what our shared values are, and there should be some shared values. Otherwise, why are we doing this work? And also shared goals. It's also helpful, I think, to just, if values are too tricky, to just talk about what are we trying to get done and see if we can agree there. But we found over and over again, in talking to folks actually who have left MAGA, and talking to folks in the Middle East, and even talking to dissidents in Argentina, all over the place, who have told us or shown us in some way or another that the work of doing what Julia just described, which is winning the narrative war, is also the work of building the movement to be bigger than just a few people who share your specific worldview. And the way to do that is to try to use shame as little as possible as a political tool, and to allow people to find their way in without having to abdicate, some core thing about themselves, because otherwise it's just going to get harder to sustain.
Thank you. So, speaking of sustaining, our next question is about how activists can combat burnout.
Yeah, we talk a little bit about the power of joy in movements and the fact that a big part of the work is actually finding joy in it so that it is nourishing to the soul and not just completely draining. We use Free DC, a group that's fighting for DC statehood and also fighting against the current martial law in DC, as a model because their mission statement is actually joy. They explicitly choose joy. They have drumming circles, they have dance parties, and when we talk also about the farm workers movement in California, that led by Dolores Forte and others, that they had, as they marched to Sacramento, the farm workers demanding better working conditions. Every single night, they put on plays, and on the back of trucks, on a flatbed truck, they would do little plays about their cause, and people really remember the joy of those moments that sort of ease the pain of the walking each day. And so that's not to say that you shouldn't also rest, but it's interesting that we found over and over again that people describe those moments as the ones that sustained them, not the ones where they were just lying in bed actually resting.
I would also add that not everyone needs to do everything all the time. So there's a movement ecology. There's a role for people. You generally, like, the thing you're good at is the thing that you should do, and that tends to be a little bit less draining than the things that you're not good at. But the other thing is that you can. There are other ways that we found in our reporting to offload some of the emotional labor of this work. So we tell the story of Claire Atkin in our book, who's an activist and also the leader and executive of an advertising boycott movement called Check My Ads, which has used the power of advertising dollars to try to fight the far right in this country and elsewhere. And she became the target as a result of her activism and sort of being forward facing. And she became the target of the online, very scary far right, to the point where the threats migrated out of the internet sphere into her life. And she talks about it to, like, someone showed up at her house. It was really, quite disturbing and alarming and dangerous. And Claire, once again, talks about how there are some technical interventions that could keep her safe and that keep people safe. She took a self-defense class, for example. But one of the things she learned in her self-defense class was that step number one is to keep those threats at bay. And the way that you keep those threats at bay is just by knowing your neighbors better. And by making sure that people know that if somebody shows up in your neighborhood and they're not supposed to be there, it's like something's off here. There are people who know you well enough, who know your life well enough, who understand the tropes of your day to day intimately enough that you don't have to do all that vigilance work on your own. You can stay vigilant, but there are other people who you can share that responsibility with. And that's really important at every level of the movement.
Thanks so much. We have to remember there is joy and some scariness in this movement. Wake County
Yeah.
Indivisible is a fairly young organization. We've been around about 18 months. And we've had a lot of successful events, but we've also made a lot of mistakes. And I think a lot of people are worried about stepping out there and making a mistake. What advice would you give to those individuals?
Oh, yeah. Well, we talk about that. That's sort of how we open the book, right? We open the book with the idea that there's no such thing as a perfect movement or perfect tactics, and that in fact, the a tactic that works one place doesn't work another place, right? The man who stood in front of the tanks in Tiananmen Square, I think we believe he was run over, and the kids who stood in front of the tanks in Nepal overthrew their government, right? So there's no tactic that works. You can't choose the perfect tactic. You can't choose the perfect strategy. You just what you do need is to have a commitment to your values and a willingness to try and a willingness to fail, right? This is where actually Silicon Valley with their fail fast thing is like, it's not as they've made it into an annoying slogan, but they're not wrong, right? That, like, you have to keep trying things because you just don't know what is going to work. And so I think that from what you told me, it sounds like you guys are doing the absolute best thing, which is learning from your mistakes, which is the only thing any movement can ever do.
I'm going to add one thing, and then I'm sorry that I have to I have to duck out early, but as Julia said before, she knows all my lines and I know hers, so it should all be good at this point. And thank you for what you're doing, and please reach out anytime. I'd love to be helpful and a partner, and so immensely grateful. Um, I'll say just two quick things on this. One is I sort of wanted to call. There was a point when we were writing the book where I told Julia I thought that maybe what we should call the book is Dissident Regrets, because so much of what we heard from people was, from the perch of it's awkward and strange to be writing a book at a moment about how to save democracy at a moment when democracy is failing all over the world. And these movements are sputtering. And what we found is that people with a little bit of hindsight, like a few years away from the movement, living in exile or whatever it was, were able to be reflective. And all of them, even those who had been fairly successful, had regrets and wanted people to learn from them. And so really the only way to do it is to go through. I'll just add one of my favorite stories that we heard in reporting the book, which is to make the point that everyone thinks they're failing until they don't. Everyone. And my favorite story of this is that in the darkest depths of the Soviet dissident movement, these dissidents, the Soviet dissidents were scientists and academics and researchers and nuclear physicists and poets and playwrights, intellectuals, and they would get together. I wish that I could have been a fly on the wall in these conversations, but they would get together and they would drink together because that's what you do. And their toast in the deepest, darkest depths of their movement was to the success of our hopeless cause, because that's how it felt. And some years later, not very long after they were making those toasts, the Berlin Wall fell. So the key, as somebody told us, Ben Nathans, who wrote a great book about Soviet dissidents, told us into this work is to be able to hold hope and hopelessness at the same time. And that includes trial and error at the same time, even as things fail and sputter, because it actually generally probably means you're winning. Thank you, guys. See you soon.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Ami.
Ciao.
I think we can hop over to the chat now.
All right, Julia, I've got another question for you. So in the chat, it was asked, it can feel so overwhelming to pick just one topic around which to rally. Do the people that you interview find community by focusing on one issue, or did they have space for multiple issues?
Oh, that's a great question. We've seen both, but I think we really focused on pro-democracy movements. And so largely we were looking at movements that had a shared value around trying to gain or regain their rights as citizens, and to forestall the lawlessness and corruption of an authoritarian. So what we did find was that is a really simple thing like that is the best way to unite a group. Like having a huge policy platform with planks on everything is different. That's political party work. But when it comes to building movements, like the movement has to be more about the philosophy, and because it needs to be a bigger tent. It needs to be able to attract a lot of people, because the goal of a movement is to be big enough that the authoritarian can't withstand it, right? Like they have all the money, they have all the guns, they have the weapons, right? They have the prisons, they have all that. The only thing we have is that there're just more of us. They can't kill us all. And I hate to say that, but that's actually that's the fact. And so so we need everyone on our side. And so that means having a pretty simple message. We have a chapter in the book about this. It's called Get the Jeep Out of the Mud. And it's basically from the movement scholar at Harvard, political scientist Erica Chenoweth, who describes successful pro-democracy movements as everybody just getting the Jeep out of the mud. Like you thought you were in a democracy. Now they've hollowed it out and made it into an authoritarian regime. You need everyone who's on board with the project of democracy to help you push the Jeep out of the mud. And then once you're out of the mud and you're on the road, then you can have your fights about all your niche issues that you want to sort out. But that is a task for after you've gotten it out of the mud.
Thanks so much. Hannah, I think you're up.
Yeah, okay. So, Julia, you've spent your career as an investigative journalist, and Ami has worked inside the government. So, how have your different perspectives shaped the book?
Oh, yeah. It was really interesting for me to work with a non-journalist. I mean, I'm traditionally written with other journalists, worked with other journalists, and it didn't actually occur to me. I wasn't looking to collaborate with a non-journalist. I just reached out to Ami because he was at the Ash Center at Harvard, which is where all the dissidents go when they're kicked out of their countries in exile. And so basically I was like, hey, I want to interview a bunch of dissidents. Maybe you can help me like round them up because they're all basically in your conference room. And so we started doing this reporting together, and I thought it was going to be like kind of a small article. But then all of a sudden when the New Yorker piece ran, a bunch of book publishers came to us, like, can you make it into a book? And it was really interesting to work with a non-journalist. I would say I would not have expected it to go as well as it did, because I would have thought like, oh, he's not gonna be able to meet deadlines, or he's not gonna be able to do this type of work. But it's interesting that they're very similar skills. Like, a politician needs to listen to their constituents and take in a huge amount of information, sort it out into some sort of distillable thing that can be communicated to the public. And so this is similar to what we do as journalists, right? We take a lot of information in from a lot of different sources and then try to distill it. And so it turned out also that Ami is way better at meeting deadlines than most journalists I work with, because I think in politics, maybe you lose your job if you don't. And in journalism, we're always like, oh, I just need another day. And like your editors are like, oh, sure. And like, so there's like a lot of squishiness in my field, even though we make it sound like there isn't. And so it was very interesting to be where he said he would deliver something on time. He was like, yeah, it was there. And I was like, wow, that never happens. So it was really fun. And I think the other thing is that he has written a lot of speeches. So he writes for speaking in a way that is just a little more, it's a more refined, right? Journalism that I have been trained in is like writing for a newspaper. It can be a little choppy, it's not designed for oration. And so I think that the combination of my like intense rigor around facts and his intense rigor around the beautiful wording ended up like bringing a lot of both to the book.
That's awesome. Thank you. We have a question from the chat. So many of our indivisible chapters are comprised primarily of women, especially in the leadership ranks. Yet we see many men among dissidents overseas. Do you think there's a reason why we in Indivisible are having such a challenge recruiting men to join the movement? And from your observations of movements around the globe, did you find any insights into how we can do better bringing more men along? And I'd love to also expand this into just like bringing more diversity among like many ways into
Yep.
the movement. So yeah.
Yeah. I think that is a interesting question. I mean, I think that our vision of dissidents is very male, partly because dissidents have been described so heroically. And obviously Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Alexei Navalny, they are heroic figures. But when you really dig into any one of those movements, you will see a lot of women doing a lot of the spade work, right? And I think that what we learned as we did more of this was that there, partly, as I was saying before, like some of the work is caring for your community, right? And that is women's work. I mean, not always, but it's traditionally been women's work. The women standing in front of the ICE detention center in Newark that I profiled, right? There are definitely men there, but it is primarily women led. And it's described as caring. We're caring for the families that are waiting 8-10 hours in the sun. We're caring for them because the state is being cruel to them and to their loved ones, and we're doing the best we can to ameliorate that, right? Our collective stubbornness in that case is to care for people the state has asked us to not care for, right? And that's often true, right? Like the Montgomery bus boycott was maintained by women with clipboards organizing who's going to drive who where, right? So that we can keep boycotting these buses that are forcing Black people to sit in the back, and that we don't agree to that. We are collectively stubborn about that, but it requires a lot of logistics, right? And so I think women have always been at a lot of the center of these movements, but not maybe always gotten their due in the history books. Um, that's also true across race and gender and age demographics, right? Um, People, I think, forget that we had a really big student movement here in the US for Palestine that was really ruthlessly suppressed, but was a really diverse movement across campuses and was doing civil disobedience right peacefully. And so I think we do have all of those people doing those things, but not maybe always under the same tent and always getting the same level of attention. I don't know if that answered if you had a recruiting question about like how to get men involved, but I have to say I've met many men involved, and I think there are a lot of men involved. But maybe in Wake County, there's a specific thing going on. I don't know.
Thanks, Julia. And that reminds us that not all the people doing the work are getting all the credit. So if somebody wanted to start becoming courageous right now, what's one of the first things that they should do? How do you strike out?
I think I I think the lowest possible lift in my mind is to start where you are, which means you are probably the member of some institution, whether it's a faith institution, a workplace, alumni association, a university you're a student at, and one of those institutions that you're affiliated with probably needs to be more courageous. And so organizing your colleagues to force an institution to be more moral than it would otherwise want to be, because institutions are amoral as an entity. They are not created around morality. And so they need to be forced to be better. And a huge part of collective stubbornness is when institutions refuse to comply with the lawlessness and corruption. And so a very easy thing to do is to just get wherever you're at to improve slightly, right? And it doesn't even have to be a huge amount. A story I like to tell from the book is about a chemistry professor at Rutgers University. When the administration was going after Columbia University and Columbia caved and acceded to all their demands, this professor at Rutgers was like, oh my God, that's horrifying. Like, Columbia has a huge endowment. We don't, like, what are we going to do? He, by the way, had no mandate. He was not the head of the like resistance or whatever. He was just a chemistry professor at the Camden campus of Rutgers. But he went on ChatGPT and was like, how do I make a NATO for universities? And he got a AI to write him like a mutual aid defense compact. And he was like, I'm going to bring this to my university senate, which I'm already on, where we mostly debate like parking rules and bookstore rules and boring stuff. And I'm going to see if we can vote on this, which is like, if they come after any one of the Big Ten, other ones will stand up for each other, right? Solidarity is always the best defense. And so he convinced his colleagues, they passed it. The other Big Ten university senates all passed it. Then it became a nationwide movement, and all these faculty around the country joined this movement for mutual aid defense. Now, anyone here who's a professor knows that actually those votes are meaningless. So God bless university senates, but the university president doesn't have to do what they say. So it wasn't like that meaningful. But I will tell you that that pressure from below helped balance out when the administration came back for their second round in the fall of last year and tried to coerce a whole new batch of universities, including Big Tens. That pressure helped to counterbalance the pressure from the top that the administration was bringing down. And so the universities resisted. Not a single one has caved so far. Now we have our fingers crossed right now for Yale. But like, you can make your institution be better. And it can even seem kind of dumb, right? Like with a petition. But it's interesting that they need pressure in order to have a spine. And so we all have the opportunity to do that.
Fabulous. I'm going to lob it over to Hannah.
Okay, awesome. So we have one more question. So, in all of the interviews you've done, what's something you wish people ask about?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, I think one thing that we like to talk about that has been asked maybe only once is why didn't we use the name Trump in the book? We chose not to use the name of the president uh, because we wanted this book to not be about him. It's about us. It's about all the people doing the heroic work. We're the main character, right? And all of our work needs to be celebrated. The people we profile in this book are not people you've heard of. They're just regular people doing courageous things because they feel like they have to, and they are not willing to live in a society that isn't the way that they wanted, that is an immoral, lawless, and corrupt society where the authoritarian steals all our rights and all our money. They don't want that. I don't want that either. And so we just didn't want this to be tarred with that brush of an individual because it's not just him, right? It's a movement. There's a well-funded movement that is attempting an authoritarian takeover of the United States and doing okay at it, to be honest, right? Like I think the data shows that it's the fastest authoritarian backslide that in terms of like how many metrics people who keep track of this keep track of like the metrics of how many authoritarian types things they manage to pull off in a certain amount of time. And so we just didn't want it to be about a person. It's about this issue that is facing the whole world. This is not just the United States. There's a rising tide of authoritarianism around the world. And by the way, I don't think it's a coincidence that Ami and I both came from covering tech, right? It's tied to a consolidation of power in our tech industry, which I argue is actually the media industry because they control all the information we see, and they control speech basically around the world. There's basically a handful of companies that control what information we can learn and what we can know, which is the role of media. That's their political, financial, cultural power. And I do think that consolidation of media enables the authoritarian project, right? And so that it's a reason we're in this global conundrum, and it's not unique to the United States. It's everyone needs to know how we fight back against this.
Thank you. We so appreciate you answering our questions. I want to make sure that I'm not missing one. So,
We do have some questions in the chat.
fabulous, Katie.
So we have a great question here from Chris, and that apparently went away. But she says here that a lot of people in her life are saying, they're not happy with the administration. They don't like what's going on, but they don't feel like we're about to lose our democracy. Based on what you're seeing, do you think that's correct, or do you think people should be more worried?
Oh, well, you don't have to take it from me. The VDEM Institute, which tracks the metrics of democracy, declared this year that we lost our status in the United States as a liberal democracy. So the the officials have called the game, and so we are definitely en route, right? And the markers of authoritarianism are, as I said a million times, corruption and lawlessness, but very specifically, some of the things that you look for in determining are you about to lose your democracy is the undermining of elections, the prosecution of political enemies, the use of violence as a censorship measure, and there's one more which I've forgotten. But anyways, we're doing all of them, and so I do think it's hard though. I understand why people are confused because it doesn't look like Stalin or Hitler or some of the things that we think of from the past, right? We're not immediately in a police state. What authoritarianism looks like these days is the hollowing out of democratic institutions while maintaining the fiction that we're still a democracy. And so if you're not paying attention and you're like, oh, I'm not really paying that much attention, like they're just talking about some weird rule change or an executive order, like how does this is like legalistic terms, you might not realize, right, that all of our democratic institutions are being hollowed out to serve the corrupt purposes of the authoritarians. And so it is worth trying to explain to people what is happening. And that's where control of the media is so important, right? Because that's why authoritarians always try really hard to control the media, because they want to make sure people don't realize what's happening, right? The frog boiling in water, so they say. And so that's why it's important that we have an independent media, that we support independent media, and we support independent voices. One thing I'm really passionate about is the fact that it doesn't have to always be the media. We profile a woman in the book, Sister Susan Francoise, who is a nun who goes every weekend to Delaney Hall ICE detention center in Newark and films for TikTok what's happening there. She's basically the journalist on the ground that I rely on to like find out what's happening there from this nun, right? And so what's interesting is we can all commit acts of journalism even if we're not journalists, because bearing witness to the crimes of the authoritarian state is, first of all, important for accountability, but secondly important because we need to make sure everyone understands what's happening. Their goal is to make sure that people don't realize it's happening.
Thank you. I think personally it's really difficult when I go out my door and nothing has changed.
Yeah.
To really believe nothing has changed. And I think as people of privilege, we don't see what really is happening if we're not paying attention and if we
Yeah.
don't have people kind of chiming in. And I want to say thank you so much to you and Ami for being here. I think we've asked all the questions. I don't
There's
want
one more, if I can interject with one more question.
absolutely.
Thank you so much. So we had someone who hasn't, we've talked, a few times about those family members, community members that say they want to do something, but never take action or just seem like they're not paying attention. But someone asked a very specific question. They have individuals in their lives that keep saying, I want to do something, and this individual is giving them something to do. Here's something that you could do right now to help this movement. And then the person goes, oh, but I can't do that. I can't do that. So with that type of person, what is the best way to get them involved?
Ask them to bring water bottles. Literally. Like, we're going to do an event. You don't even have to come. Just show up, pull up in your car, unload water bottles, leave. Like, bring it down to that level, right? And if they can't do that, like, then maybe it may be a lost cause, but like, I think people are always coming up with reasons why they can't. And that's why we talk a lot about the techniques of, I think Ami was talking about bring the blankets, right? Like just asking for something so small that it's hard to say no to. I think it's worth thinking about this through the lens of labor organizing. So labor organizers this is a known technique for like when you're trying to figure out if you can organize a workplace, you make small asks of people to figure out like who's willing to sort of like take a small risk for you, right? And then once they get enough people like that, then they have a meeting and then start to organize, et cetera. And in some ways, what we're trying to do, what an anti-authoritarian movement is, we are collectively bargaining for our democracy, just like laborers collectively bargain with an employer. We're basically saying, look, we don't want to work under these conditions, right? We don't want to comply. We want a new contract, right? I mean, actually, to be fair, in this particular case, we want the old contract. We want the Constitution. Remember, we agreed on that shit. Let's do that. Okay. So yeah, it needs a little tweaking around the edges, but we'd be happy with it kind of basically as written. And so, so we're collectively bargaining. And so learning from their techniques, which is you make the ask really, really small. Can you bring a snack? Could you drop off some towels, right? Like, and then, at a certain point you do have to give up on people, but I would say like only do that after you've made a small ask multiple times.
That's a great idea. Thank you.